Dr. Myers.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank the ASEAN Policy Institute for having me, and it's a special privilege to share a panel with KDO. I like this session topic. I often ignore session topics because they seem kind of stupid, but I like this one because it speaks to the really important issue of North Korea's longevity. I was at a conference last week in the Schiller Hotel, and the head of an American think tank that shall remain nameless said, North Korea is a failed state on every level. And he said this in the sort of tone of voice as if this was something self-evident that we all already believe. And I don't believe that. And I don't think anybody who's been to North Korea in the past few months or ever is going to go along with the notion that North Korea has failed. To fail as a state means that you lose the confidence of your people. And I see no indication that the North Korean regime or state has lost the confidence of its people. To talk about longevity, you know, there have been a couple theories of North Korea's longevity bouncing around, but it seems like a certain unseriousness descends on the scholarly community whenever this comes up. Among the right-wingers or the hardline observers of North Korea, you still have this notion that North Korea survives by dint of excessive repressiveness alone, by brutality alone. And I'm starting to think that this point really just has no place anymore in a serious discussion, because the North Korean regime is still unable or unwilling to seal off the northern border. You know, we hear all this talk about how it's tightening up, but it's still not prohibitively expensive to cross the border, and people do it all the time, and they cross it in both directions. And we're seeing videos and photographs of altercations with security forces, or altercations between women at these markets and security forces, which would be hard to imagine even in Los Angeles, let alone in the East Bloc. So I don't think that this totalitarian model really has any kind of tenability anymore. Just as unpersuasive for me is this orthodox, liberal, academic notion according to which North Korea has survived so long because it did such a great job of adapting communism to indigenous traditions, especially Confucianism. Now, why a pre-colonial elite tradition should have appealed so much to the North Korean masses anyway is a question that these people never answer. Also the question of just how a young and avowedly anti-Confucian leadership educated under the Japanese or in the Soviet Union got this familiarity with the Sino-Korean classic tradition that is always attributed to it. Americans often seem to think that this is something that Koreans just pick up around the house, like filial piety and respect for the elderly. I just read a book a couple of months ago which attributed North Korea's efforts at economic reform to the Shidhak school of 17th century, 18th century Confucianism. Now, the tendentiousness, I think, is obvious here. There's this very clear effort to burnish the reputation of this dictatorship by tracing its roots back to a long and respectable tradition. But there's really no evidence for it at all. There's nothing distinctly Confucian about the North Korean state. The family symbolism of the personality cult, which is always used as Exhibit A, is actually less Confucian than the family symbolism of the Soviet personality cult, for example, where you really did have a didactic, paternal, Confucian ombu, a kind of leader, and not the chamo leader that you have in North Korea, where you have an androgynous parent leader. And the distinguishing characteristics of North Korea, ethno-nationalism, ultra-militarism, these all run directly counter to Confucius. So this model doesn't really work either. Now, there's one model that seems equally popular on the left and on the right for different reasons, and this is the notion that is in the title of the session, which is the idea that North Korea does not just have a metaphorical cult, a cult of personality. And as you know, Khrushchev was not speaking literally when he spoke of a cult lichnosti, or a cult of personality in the Soviet Union. But the idea that North Korea is literally like a religious community united in devotion to a godlike leader. And I never know just how seriously this is meant. I don't know how seriously Katie just meant it just now when she was saying he's like a god, he's like Jesus. And I don't know how seriously Professor Wintrobe meant it this morning when he was talking about a theocracy. I do occasionally encounter, say, American Christians or members of Christian NGOs who really think that Juche is a religion, a rival religion. And I do occasionally come in contact with foreign journalists who think that the North Koreans really mean it when they say that songbirds sang in celebration of Kim Jong Il's birth. But I think most of the people in this room, I think I'm right in assuming that when you talk about North Korea as a cult, you're really just using that as hyperbole in order to stress the intensity and the near unanimity of people's devotion to their leader. And I find that this assumption comes with another assumption, namely that the leader of North Korea is, so to speak, a law unto himself. He's above ideology, and the people are going to follow him no matter what direction he chooses to go, and the people are going to go after him because he's like a god to them. And the hardliners, for the hardliners, the implication is that North Korea is an especially dangerous state because, like religious fanatics, the North Korean people will conceivably follow their leader into a war they know they cannot win. For the softliners, the implication is it doesn't matter how North Korea has behaved in the past. It doesn't matter how it behaves now. All we need to do is win Kim Jong Il's trust, and the country can change from one day to the next. And this soft line notion is actually more common in the North Korea discourse. Those of you who know my work know that I constantly argue that North Korea's race theory, Kim Jong Il's own frequent pronouncements that the Americans can never change, Korea and the United States can never share the same sky, that these pronouncements indicate that North Korea has no serious interest in normalizing relations with the United States, and indeed it cannot do so without sacrificing legitimacy and all reason to exist as a separate state. And when I say this, I see people starting to grin, and they interrupt me and say, hey, come on, this is Kim Jong Il. He's like a god up there. If he tells the people it's time to normalize relations with the United States, then they'll do that. And this assumption, I think, is also implicit in the increasingly common notion, I think advanced among others by my friend Andrei Lankov, that despite North Korea's current ethno-nationalism, it can have a viable future as a vassal state of China. And the Chinese might even be able to install a candidate of their own liking into the leadership in Pyongyang, and the North Korean masses are going to sign off on that. And broadly speaking, that's what I want to argue against it in the time remaining to me. First of all, to be absolutely clear, at no point in North Korean history have supernatural powers ever been attributed to either of the two Kims. That has never happened. Occasionally, writers will talk about peasants in North Korea, old folks, who think that, because the two Kims are so marvelous that they must have some magical powers. But these are always talked about in a sort of ironic, joking tone. And they'll talk about South Koreans coming to Pyongyang and saying, oh, I think Kim Jong Il is the Messiah. But again, this is not what they themselves are saying. And sure, the North Koreans will say that songbirds sang in celebration of Kim Jong Il's birth, but they don't mean that any more literally than Walt Whitman meant that Abraham Lincoln was the captain of a ship. It's called metaphor. Now, there is a religious quality to the personality cult, without question, but the same can be said for all of our political cultures, all of our cultures in general. I often get the impression in North Korean studies that people just act as if Freud and Rank and all these social psychologists just never lived. According to these people, and it's a very convincing case, all of our cultures are, in essence, immortality ideologies. We try to give our finite animal lives a special significance by believing that the meaning of our lives lives on after we die. And the North Korean state, I think, has a very, very persuasive myth persuading North Koreans that whether they're bus drivers or coal miners or whatever, that they all have a very important part to play in the mission to liberate the peninsula from Yankee rule, and that this mission will live on even after they die. And this is one reason why the North Korean state has been so successful in ensuring and bolstering state loyalty. This is where North Korea has an enormous advantage over South Korea. South Koreans are not generally loyal to their state. When the South Korean looks at the taegukgi, he does not see the kukka, he does not see the state, he sees the minjok, he sees the race. Now, I could recite poll statistics that would really, I think, surprise the foreign people here. When you really look at just how little loyalty or affection South Koreans feel for their state, it makes you realize this is the real security story down here. The first Korean War, I think we all are aware that it was launched by Kim Il-sung in the expectation that South Koreans would not defend themselves. And this is how it was sold to Stalin and Mao as well. And this is why the North Koreans, thank God, cooled their heels in Seoul for 3 days instead of pressing their advantage. They were expecting the provinces to rise up. And even though that wish failed to fulfill itself, the North Koreans never lost their hope for a South Korean uprising. And I think this is something that they still believe in. But to get back to North Korea, yes, there is a religious dimension to the personality cult, just as there is to every ideology, but that doesn't mean that Kim Jong Il is regarded as a god. Now, as for the intensity with which the personality cult is believed, I think we've talked enough about this today. The dominant personality cult is, of course, the cult of Kim Il-sung. Kim Jong Il is not spoken about with the same degree of veneration. This is something you notice when you go up there and you talk to your guides and minders. But having said that, Kim Jong Il's cult is on much firmer ground now than it was when he first took over. Back then, his legitimacy was really a question of the reflected glory from Kim Il-sung. And now he has his own reputation as a builder of North Korean might. But no political leader, and I can't stress this enough, no political leader, no matter how powerfully he is, can redefine or reinvent his myth at will. Even a truly divine leader can't do that. I mean, if Jesus Christ were to come back today and preach the opposite of the Gospels, the Christian church would be the first to disavow him. Adolf Hitler could not move away from the anti-Semitism that he espoused, whether he believed in it or not. Now, the main pillars of Kim Jong-il's legitimacy are his reputation as the rightful heir to the Kim Il-sung tradition and his reputation as the guarantor of North Korean might and military supremacy. And he cannot do without these pillars of legitimacy. He has to keep ruling in accordance with the policies that he's already followed. In other words, he cannot disarm. He cannot normalize relations with the United States and South Korea. He cannot do these things without losing the legitimacy to rule the country. No matter what kind of inducements we offer him, he cannot do this. And I think the sooner we recognize this and dispense with our wishful thinking, the better. And still less can Kim Jong-il reduce his country to being a vassal state of China or be replaced by somebody of Beijing's choosing and expect the masses to go along with that. That just is not going to happen. Now, my evidence for this, or just one piece of evidence I think that I can use here, is the Kim Jong-un cult, and this is where we get really topical. If Kim Jong-il really were a godlike, Jesus-like leader who could, reinvent his myth at will, he would be going about this succession issue in a very different way. He would be able to say, much as his own father did about him in the 70s and 80s, this is my choice to lead you, let the veneration begin. If Kim Jong-il were a law unto himself, he would be able to say, sure, the kid studied in Switzerland, so what? We don't need to take that ethno-nationalism so seriously. Instead of which, we have this very gradual, almost shamefaced, almost comically vague cult of the young general, which won't tell us where and how he grew up, which won't even tell us whose son he is. I'm not sure whether we can believe these rumors that he's going to be presented as Kim Il-sung's son, in other words, as Kim Jong-il's younger half-brother. But the important thing is there's nothing in the print media at the moment which would make that course of action impossible. It is a conceivable way for them to go. But of course, his main claim to fame is as a military genius, because that is the only way that he can conceivably be pitched to the masses. In other words, this budding Kim Jong-un cult is a perfect illustration of the rigid ideological boundaries within which the leader himself must operate. He is not a law above himself, unto himself. And this brings me back to where I started with the question of the North's longevity. We marvel at North Korea's longevity because we misperceive it as a failed communist state, instead of realizing that it is in fact a highly successful ethno-nationalist state. It's a state on the far right of the ideological spectrum. And I always encounter resistance to this whenever I bring it up to American audiences, whether they're left-wing or right-wing or military or diplomatic. The left wing doesn't want George W. Bush let off the hook for bullying this country, so they don't like it. The right wing doesn't want Karl Marx let off the hook for creating this horrible place, so they don't like it. The American military, naturally enough, does not like to consider the notion that what they're doing here is protecting moderate nationalists from radical ethno-nationalists. That's not a particularly glamorous role to be playing. The diplomats don't like it because their business is negotiation, and hopes for negotiation rest on the assumption that this is a late Cold War state. But I'm sorry, there really is just no way to keep presenting this country as a communist state. And when it's done in this kind of self-evident fashion, as it's been done here, I always want to say, well, where is the evidence now? You have here a national socialist, military-first state with a race theory. Now, whenever I talk about North Korea's race theory, somebody in Question Time always says, but what about Stalin's socialism in one country idea? That shows that communism can be nationalist. It can't be ethno-nationalist. There's a very big difference. What Stalin was doing was putting the interests of a multi-ethnic state in front of all others. And then people say, well, there was xenophobia in China too. Sure, xenophobia is thousands of years old. We've got xenophobia around the world. Ethno-nationalism, on the other hand, or race theory, is a very new and modern phenomenon, and quite a rare one. It was rare even in European fascism. You know, the Nazis were really the only fascists in Europe with a race theory until the late 1930s, and it's completely incompatible with Karl Marx. But I realize that people at these conferences don't really take ideology very seriously. I think only in North Korean studies would you have a conference devoted to the viability of the North Korean state and not have a single session devoted to ideology. So let me just talk about mechanisms and organizations, because these are things that people seem to take more seriously. Look at the North Korean Workers' Party. That party does not behave like a communist party. The communist parties of the East Bloc were above the state, directing the state even in daily affairs. You read about how the East German Party actually called ministers to it on a daily basis and told them what they had to do. In North Korea, there are so many indications that the party is fulfilling the traditional role of a right-wing party that is under the state, an adjunct to the state. You have the extreme infrequency and brevity of party conferences. There hasn't been a full Congress in over 30 years. You have the party's official nickname as Mother Party, which shows you that it doesn't wear the pants in the state, so to speak. You have the fact that Kim Jong Il is not referred to as the general secretary of the party. He is referred to as 국방위원장, the literal translation of which is State Council Chairman. Okay? And the reason that a right-wing party plays such a lesser role is because ethno-nationalism is easy enough for a child to understand. A right-wing party cannot pose as the indispensable interpreter of doctrine the way that a communist party can. So the Workers' Party's function in North Korea is simply to propagandize, to snoop, and to do all these things. And if you look at the content of their study sessions, it's very simple propaganda, albeit weighted towards the kind of anti-South Korean bellicose propaganda that the regime likes to keep out of the official media for obvious reasons. So once we understand, I'm going to wrap up right now, once we understand what kind of a state this is, we can dispense with all these tortuous and mystic theories of its legitimacy. We can stop claiming, in face of all evidence, that this is an ultra-totalitarian state. We can stop, all this mystic mumbo-jumbo about a mass susceptibility to ancient Confucian influences. And we can stop thinking that the Korean people, the North Koreans, are so stupid as to really think that Kim Jong Il can walk through mountains and so on. Realizing that this is a far-right state, of course, means realizing just how futile it is to pursue late Cold War solutions to the nuclear crisis. But that's just something I think we have to face. We're going into an especially dangerous period right now. We have a South Korean presidential election next year. We have a South Korean public that is furiously conveying to North Korea an unwillingness to defend itself. And we have the North Korean state under enormous pressure to divert public attention away from the failures of the Strong and Prosperous Country campaign. So we're going into a very dangerous time, and I think if we realize now what kind of a state this is and begin drawing the logical conclusions from it, then it might not be too late. I'm going to start there. Thanks.
I've been asked by the organizer to chair this session and also make a presentation. And I have a very different background from my friends on the panel. And so my task is very actually simple. Just to provoke my friends, and I don't really disagree with anything you say, just that I'm supposed to offer a different perspective on the question that we are asking here, and why North Korea regime has proven to be so stable. And Since my background is in game theory and rational choice theory, maybe I'll draw on some of the theories to offer some simple explanations as to why North Korea doesn't really need to change much or doesn't have to do much to survive. Okay? So whenever we say something, rationalist theory on in social science, we just assume that whatever we observe, whatever we have in this world is rational, meaning that they are the outcomes of rational choices by rational actors. And from this perspective, North Korean stability is no different, must be rational. We just assume that. So it must be a rational outcome. And another way of saying this is that North Korean leaders really are capable of maintaining their power or even policy that they like, because a set of incentives they face really allow them to do so. Okay, they don't really have to change in response to these incentives. Now the question then is that who and what shapes the incentives that North Korean leaders face. Now there must be a lot of factors here, but I will divide factors into domestic sources and international sources. And domestically, North Korean leaders must be most interested in responding to threats to their power. And these threats, to be effective and credible, must be organized threat. And there has to be some opposing, challenging groups within North Korea that can present themselves as an alternative to the North Korean regime. But we all know that there are no such a group. We wish we had one, but we don't. And let's think about what the consequences of this fact is for North Korea. Lack of legitimate, credible domestic opposition, to me, has just two consequences. First, North Korean leaders have a lot of options or room to maneuver or deal with the problems that they have. And normally, a leader, in political crisis, choose from at least 4 different options. Okay? I'm drawing on a theory called selectorate theory. Selectorate means that the group of people who participate in the selection of leaders, selectorate. And typically they can improve their policy, public policy, so they can improve the welfare of their people so that they can increase a public support for their regime. This public policy can take many different forms. Ideology can be a public policy, national security or nationalism, or even economic reforms. There are a whole range of policies they can choose to make their people happy. The second option is what we call private benefit to their cronies. They have the core supporters that they need to satisfy. And we have been hearing all the stories about handing out Mercedes-Benz to the generals, and the North Koreans have been doing this all along, that they have enough resources to keep their core supporters happy. So private benefit, you can use private benefits to maintain your power. Then purges is another way. You can reduce the size of your what you call majority winning coalition, and to keep them nervous. And we know that North Korea has been doing this very often, that they use purges to maintain power. And the last tactic usually is to expand their power base, meaning like party membership. Increase the number of people with a stake in North Korean regime by expanding the size of what we call this electorate. So, surprisingly, leaders have a lot of options to deal with a crisis. And the problem is in North Korea that there's no alternative and no opposition group that present any alternative view that creates a lot of space for Kim Jong Il to move around. They really doesn't have to do much. That's my second point, that given the situation that Kim Jong Il really does not have to be very brilliant. to survive. In the absence of any threat, opposition he really doesn't have to come up with brilliant ideas or strategies. He just can get by doing minimal. And my expression, I would just say, muddling through is good enough for him. So that's how he survives. So I mean, these conclusions naturally follow from the premise that I made, that is that they are rational, that there's no really legitimate domestic opposition. Then consequences are fairly obvious and straightforward. And the threats and pressure can also come from outside, not just inside. Here too, North Korean leaders really haven't faced much pressure. Maybe this is a very controversial statement, but I really don't think that that anybody, South Korea especially, has really pushed North Koreans much. And the two reasons, right, that no country wants to really present itself as an alternative to North Korean regime. And now South Korea is a natural candidate. Since North Korea is a part of our old territory, naturally we can say that, well, that we can be an alternative to Kim Jong Il, then we are ready to take over. We can offer visions to North Korean people. Well, certainly South Koreans are not interested in taking over or replacing North Korean regime themselves. So that threat does not exist. But the minimum South Korea can do is to actually present policies strong enough to induce North Korea to change. But I don't think we've been doing that either. For that matter, nobody has been doing that. And the reason is that nobody has been able to pursue very consistent policies toward North. As a result, has not applied any real pressure on North Korea. We all know why we do this, that why everyone is pursuing very inconsistent policy. I mean, alternating between hardline policies and softline policies, and these policies have been inconsistent across time and among allies. So maybe next year we'll get lucky that we'll have same type of government in all countries. I mean, even then, I don't know how China will. I'm talking about Japan, the United States, and South Korea. That we have a conservative government now. The United States has liberal government, but as conservative as South Korea. The Japan now government is more liberal, but we don't know what will happen next year when the new government come in, whether the three countries were able to coordinate their policy. But China always has different incentives, so it's hard to coordinate policies with China. And these problems, right, the domestic politics, I say, is a major cause of this inconsistency. And if you think about this, why everyone is so divided over North Korea, I claim that it's because there's fundamental uncertainty about North Korean intentions, what North Koreans are really trying to do with their nuclear weapons and all that. And this kind of uncertainty affects not only South Korean policy toward North, but also American or Japanese policy toward the North. Usually we say there are two groups in Korea, or in the United States. In other countries, the hardliners and the softliners. Hardliners believe that North Korea is what I call the military type, whose real objective is the military takeover of South Korea. Now, this fear is stronger in Korea, in Seoul, but these are the hardliners who believe that North Korea is a certain type, has certain preferences. And softliners, on the other hand, sunshine policy supporters, consider North Korea as more of reformist type, meaning that their main interest is lies in domestic economic development and stability. There are certain tactics you can use, what we call in game theory, separate these two types, what true intentions of North Korea are. Game theory tells us that that we can actually separate them, North Korean type, if we mix economic and military incentives. Meaning, what I mean is that hardliners usually favor a policy that are hardline both economically and militarily. That is, no economic cooperation, and also want to put military pressure on North Korea. Those are the typical hardline policy. And softline sunshine policy favors policy that are softline across issues. Okay? Little military pressure and a lot of economic exchanges. Now, if you offer these two options, packages to North Korea, the problem is that the military type, North Korean military type, favors softline policies. You understand that they both, the reform type or the military type, like the softline package better than hardline package, so that you cannot really tell the difference. Using these two hardline and softline packages. So instead, what we have to do is that we have to offer them something presenting conflicting actually incentive. That is, that we offer them economic help and assistance. On the other hand, we increase our defense spending or asking for political concession, military concession. So we combine the softline economic policy with the hardline economic policy. If we do that, the North Korean, if they are the reformist type, if they are really interested in the reform, they wouldn't care about what we do, like how much, I'm talking about South Korea, money we spend on our defense, because they don't really are not interested in attacking South Korea anyway, so what kind of military force they have, assuming that South Korea will never attack the North, which is probably a fairly good assumption. So the reformist type will then will only like that economic package we offer, and they wouldn't really care much about our military policy, defense policy. And if they are the military type, of course they reject this, because they are always looking for an opportunity to put a surprise attack on South Korea, so they care more about our military preparedness or military posture than whatever economic incentive we offer to them. So this kind of policy, if we get lucky, with this kind of policy, we'll be able to separate North Korean types. And the problem is that, as you know, that this is the package that are not really coherent ideologically. Let's say South Korean conservatives, I don't know whether they will be able to experiment with this kind of package, because their ideology, the rigidness of the ideology would not allow them to pursue these flexible policies, meaning a hardline security policy plus combined with the soft-line economic policy. So I don't think that the liberals in South Korea will also be able to pursue this, adopt this and implement them, because it's not really consistent with their ideology. So this problem, I think, exists not only in South Korea, but also in other countries, that the net result is that, we alternate between hardline and softline policies, and these situation has two consequences. First, North Korea can always find someone who can offer economic assistance without really demanding any political concessions. So they can divide and conquer the other countries. So they don't really have to change much. And as I said, given their domestic situation, they don't need a lot of resources to survive anyway, since they can always divide and conquer the major countries. They don't really need to change. And to the extent that this kind of external behavior helps their regime, the continuation of this practice allows them to consolidate their power domestically, because it's supposed to be a very popular policy domestically, standing up to great powers. So two consequences: that they don't have to change because of the situation, and they don't have to change, and they don't have to do. Then the fact that they don't have to change helps them to survive. So maintain their power. maybe I made everything too simplistic. So in conclusion, I've not really studied North Korea for 10 years, and I'm glad, I thank the organizers for inviting me and to think about these issues again. And whenever I hear this debate about North Korea and why they are so stable, people tend to think it's a big surprise. I mean, then, if you start asking basic fundamental questions, then really, I mean, it's not really hard to understand because nobody really tries to destabilize them. So what I'm saying is that if you think about the domestic stability there, why there's no really opposition, no country really tried to create opposition or promote opposition in North Korea. And I think if the South Korea is willing to take up that task, I don't think we'll succeed with 100% guarantee, but will make some difference. And so my conclusion is all our fault, South Korea's fault. That if you understand South Korean policy to North Korea, you understand why North Korea is having such an easy time maintaining their power. That's my just simple point. I don't know if it's a rationalist explanation, but it's fairly straightforward explanation for their stability. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we have about 30 minutes for question and answers, and okay, yeah. Yeah, why don't you introduce yourself and yeah.
Andy Salmon, Washington Times. Hello. I think this month or next month, Sir Ian Kershaw, the great biographer of Hitler, has a new book coming out. I think it's called The End or The End Game or something. And in that book, he attempts to explain, how and why Nazi Germany fought World War II for about 3 years with no rational hope whatsoever of any kind of final victory. They only gave up after they were shattered on the battlefield and most of the country was overrun. And of course, you could extend the same argument pretty much to Imperial Japan. They didn't give up until their armies in Burma, the Pacific, Manchukuo had been defeated and they were facing virtual nuclear annihilation. And yet in both these countries, there was, not with outside assistance, but there was internal resistance in a very small way to both those regimes. Moreover, even so, they still carried on to the end. They managed to overcome that. So my questions are threefold, if I may, using those examples. One, given the lack of rationality in those two states, and yet the fact that they still managed to maintain social cohesion and a fighting spirit until the end, is there any possibility of a soft landing for the North Korean regime, or must it end, in blood and fire? Second question, could you perhaps explain on why there is no, I'm not talking about any external opposition or any externally sponsored opposition, why is there no or very, very little internal opposition, which we saw even inside the Third Reich and inside Imperial Japan in the final days? And last question, again, going back to Nazi Germany. After the endgame, denazification was tremendously successful. There was no or virtually no post-war resistance or resurgence of the Nazi movement. Could we perhaps, despite, as Katie was saying, the terrible brain damage and the mind control these people have been undergoing for so long, is it feasible we could have a successful process of de-Kim Jong Ilism in perhaps a relatively short time? Thank you.
Let this brilliant man speak first.
Are we answering right away? Okay. I think the question about Nazi Germany, about the unity, that I just read a history of the Nazi Party. It was very interesting. The reason I think a far-right state is so much more stable and holds on to sort of a fervent emotional support so much longer than the communist states could is because in the communist countries, the state was very correctly seen to be under the party. So as the party's prestige declined, the prestige of the state declined with it. In a far-right state, the state is equated with a race. It's seen as something above the party. So the respect for the party can decline and people can still feel ready to die for the state. And of course, the Third Reich is a prime example of that. Nazi Party officials were so unpopular in the last 6 or 7 months of the Third Reich that they weren't supposed to wear their uniforms in public. They'd get beaten up. And yet there was complete support for the Third Reich until the very last day. And you say there was some opposition inside the Third Reich. Well, there was no support at all for surrender until the very last day of the Third Reich. So when you ask about the possibility of a soft landing, I really don't know. I mean, if you look at Japan, we have this very famous case of the emperor pretty much telling people, look, from one day to the next, up till now I've told you that fighting the Americans is in our interest, and from tomorrow on, helping the Americans is going to be in our interest. And pretty much everybody went along with that. But that brought with it, of course, Hirohito's demotion to mere mortality. And I don't see Kim Jong Il being ready to take that step downward. Could we denazify the North Koreans or de-Kim Il-sungify them? We could, but we won't. I know what's going. I have a pretty good idea what's going to happen. Those North Koreans, we have never discredited. Kim Il-sung has never been discredited the way that Hitler was discredited, the way that communism was discredited. Kim Il-sung has not been discredited and never will be discredited to those North Korean people. And when unification comes, they will say, with a certain amount of justification, hey, you've got statues of Park Chung-hee in Gyeongsang-do, you've got statues of Kim Young-sam, we want our statues left up. And I do believe that a lot of those Kim Il-sung statues are going to remain after unification. And you're going to have them forming their own voting bloc with Molpyo, just like you have in Jeollado. I think this Seoul is going to lack the political will to denazify or de-Kim Il-sungify those people, because so many people here in South Korea continue to believe that at least North Korea started out right, and South Korea didn't. You have this revisionist myth here in South Korea that this is the eternally tainted, failed state. And the North Koreans, they started out right and deserve points on that account. So.
I didn't see the copy of my very simple 2-page paper. Did you get it? The opening closed minds. I sent it on deadline very punctually, and mine is not there. And actually, the Andy's question, the last half page I devoted. I must confess that I'm a political scientist in disciplinary training, but I do a lot of work with my husband, who is a social psychologist. He brings a very different perspectives, very fair person, no bias. I am biased because I'm a Korean product. It took about 30 years for me to de-learn what I learned in Korea to become an American social scientist. But Ralph Hessig is a very, very open, fair-minded. We do like to see, maybe because of his influence, I like to see human beings without biases. I tend to respect North Koreans and Koreans slightly more than somebody indicated. I think if we give them enough chance, closing minds can be opened. I think there is a truth prevail in a sense, because there is only one truth for everything. As an English great literary writer, there is only one word for one action or one description. North Koreans will realize when they were given enough time, which I already saw out of 22,000 North Korean defectors, bright mind, educated mind, de-learn what they learned in North Korea and become a normal human being. I think there is enough evidence that the history will be rebuilt and North Koreans can be going through the de-learning process. If South Korea is strategically sharp and oriented toward enough better future of two Koreas, I tend to respect that much better. So I have a hope.
Okay, we'll collect 3 or 4 questions and then ask the panelists. Nick, you are next. Why don't you wait?
Nick Eberstadt from American Enterprise Institute. This is an excellent session. Congratulations. Very, very thought-provoking. I've got a question for any of the panelists who'd care to address it, and one specifically for Brian. The general question is this: do any of our panelists see a better analogy or better model for the DPRK than the interwar Japanese dictatorship, emperor worship, militarization, all of that? Is there any model that's closer to reality for DPRK than the interwar Japanese military dictatorship? Second question, Brian, for you in particular. I'm sympathetic with your impatience with the totalitarian model. I mean, it's a sloppy word. I mean, from Friedrich and Brzezinski on, it's kind of a swamp intellectually, but maybe not entirely without some of its uses. Let's say, for example, that Lenin understood totalitarianism better than Friedrich and Brzezinski. As you remember, back in 1920, Lenin had that wonderful comment, "We recognize nothing private," which kind of explained his kind of approach towards government. Is there anything that the current North Korean regime recognizes as private?
Okay. Professor Chan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mine will be kind of a follow-up question to yours. I also have some questions about the totalitarian state. You said North Korea is not necessarily a totalitarian state case, but I think North Korea has every element of totalitarian state still. And I can raise a question about the session title, Cult or Totalitarian State. I would rather say a cult plus or a cult and a totalitarian state. North Korean use elements of Confucianism, like serving parents, and we also find elements like serving Japanese emperor, demanding unquestionable royalty, and totalitarian state. It is just still dictatorship, and they use force. It's just suppressing the people. So how can you deny that kind of elements? And comparing with East European countries, they had previously experience of political pluralism. They have strong religious legacies, but in North Korea, it didn't exist. So, Kim Il-sung is, a disciple or student of Stalin, little Stalin. You said never discredit. In 1953, right after the Korean War, they purged South Korean, Communist Party members. And 1956 and 7, when he was seriously challenged, August Revolt, they again purged many. So he was also discredited. After Khrushchev came to power, he was in a dangerous situation. So it's a different story. And you mentioned North Korea is not necessarily interested in normalizing relations with the United States. North Korea says every source of misery of North Korean people is United States. It has tried to normalize relations because it's an unsurmountable obstacle. It is a formidable enemy. So I can't agree with you in the point. And regarding the party, you said it's a propaganda machine, kind of. But it's more than that, actually. It is a kind of instrument to go upward mobility. That's why most North Korean people are anxious to join or to be a member. And it's also like a nerve system, as Juche Sasang argues. It reaches the people. Without that, you can't effectively rule the people. Thank you.
Robert Park, who was held in North Korea after going there on a rather... Don Kirk is my name. Robert Park, who was held in North Korea after going there on a very bizarre expedition, which I think a lot of us are familiar with, has been saying in writing and in talking and so forth, has been accusing the regime of genocide against its own people. Now, I'm sure that that might be regarded as an exaggeration, but I wonder if panelists could address the issue of executions and the Gulag system and how this relates to some of the points that you've been raising, because I don't think, unless I miss something, which is certainly possible, I don't think that that's come up in this discussion. So your view of that, Brian and Katie and Mr. Mo, I certainly very much appreciate your view. Thank you.
Can we have Peter back? He's been trying to get a question.
I guess I'll make a couple of comments real quick to challenge our speakers a bit. Brian, you haven't made the sale with me of rejecting the notion of totalitarian state or a cult of personality. When I have a general audience, in fact, I describe North Korea as a totalitarian personality cult. And the only example that you cited for arguing that North Korea isn't a totalitarian regime is that you occasionally have sporadic and spontaneous demonstrations in markets, but I only know of a handful in the last decade. So if North Korea isn't a totalitarian regime, I don't think there are any in the world. So to me, North Korea, when I see what's happening in Syria, the amount of dissent and voices coming out of Syria, unimaginable for North Korea and for the foreseeable future. So, and you yourself just talked about the de-Kim Il-sungization of North Korea. That, to me, is the essence of a personality cult. I read Nodong Shinmun almost as much as you do, and they don't talk about Joseon Minjok, they talk about Kim Il-sung Minjok. I mean, that to me defines personality cult around the Kim family. So I think these terms are, I don't know why you're running away from these terms or challenging the use of these terms, because they do seem to define North Korea. And for Professor Mo, you argued that we haven't put any pressure on North Korea. You seem to have forgotten the early Bush years when we had the axis of evil, and they were not listed in alphabetical order. We had stealth fighters being sent to Guam. We had the demonization of North Korea, President Bush calling him a pygmy, and one of his key advisors pointing to Nick Eberstadt's book, The End of North Korea, and saying that's what our policy is towards North Korea. The sanctions that have been imposed on North Korea, financial and otherwise, cracking down their bank accounts. So I think we have tried China certainly hasn't supported it and never will. But the rest of, the most important country for North Korea has tried pressure, and it didn't work. So I was wondering if you could explain what you mean by we haven't put pressure on North Korea.
Yeah, I'll just go first. I'm not running. I at no point today have I denied that North Korea has a personality cult. All I did was emphasize that the word cult has to be understood in a metaphorical sense the way the Khrushchev meant it. This is not a religious community united around a divine leader. I agree. I wrote a book about a personality cult in North Korea last year. I'm not running away from the notion at all. Nor do I deny that the North Korean regime wants to be as totalitarian as possible. My problem is with the totalitarian model, which attributes North Korea's longevity to its totalitarian nature. That's what I have a problem with. When you have a state that people can bribe their way out of and also want to bribe their way back into, you need to start thinking about something else except to explain everything by pointing to totalitarian repressiveness. That just isn't going to work. And I think those of us, I don't know how many people here are old enough to have been to East Germany as well. You've been to East Berlin and you've been to Pyongyang. And it's a very, very different mood. When I think totalitarian, I think East Berlin. I think a nation of dispirited people under 24/7 lockdown. People basically going through the motions because they have no choice. They're locked up. And that is not what I see in North Korea. I think what we are overlooking here today is the extent to which people want to be a part of that kind of system. I'm sure your husband as a social psychologist can talk all about this. People want to be dominated. Sigmund Freud said that this is one of the great urges of human beings, and our own ideology makes us want to overlook that fact. If I can just go back, genocide, I think Robert Park needs to look up the word genocide in the dictionary. I mean, it's the notion that the North Korean government would want to exterminate the Korean people is just, for me, just too unserious to talk about. Executions, sure, this is important. Again, I'm not running away from the notion that this is a repressive state. It's a highly repressive state. It's one of the most repressive states in the world. My problem is with the notion that its longevity owes itself primarily to repressiveness. I don't believe that's the case. Kim Il-sung has never been discredited on ethno-nationalist grounds. I should make that clear. The Confucianism of people serving their parents. For one thing, filial piety in Korea predates Confucianism. It's something Koreans seem to have forgotten. And go out on the street and ask a Korean about Confucius, and they'll give you a blank look. Confucianism formalized filial piety and formalized respect for the elderly, but these are very important things even in the Buddhist tradition before that. So I don't want to deny that there are some indigenous elements to the North Korean personality cult, but we have nothing from saying they're Confucian. That implies a worldview which is completely at variance with what the North Koreans preach. Is there anything the current North Korean regime recognizes as private? I would say, by declaring itself a military first state, it basically signaled to the people that they would have a lot more leeway in going about their own livelihoods than they did before. And this, again, is something very different from what I think of as a pure totalitarian state, like in East Germany, where really every single thing was scrutinized by the state. We have a situation here which is comparable, I think, to wartime Japan. These crackdowns that you have on black markets in Japan, in North Korea, are very similar to what you had in Japan. They were also going around arresting young people for being in the markets, not because they were anti-capitalist, but because they thought that young people should be put to better use elsewhere. They're very similar things. But also the state loyalty. Every Japanese person went to these black markets in order to survive during the war. That did not mean that they did not have state loyalty. They were very loyal to the state regardless. Is there a better model than interwar Japanese dictatorship? I don't like models, period. And my big problem as a North Korea scholar is this whole international relations, this whole IR state theory stuff, which sort of tries to stuff everything into little typological boxes, and people don't seem to think it necessary really to get in touch with a culture and with the historical situation of each country. I don't think we need a model. I'm not saying North Korea is so completely unique that no other examples can help us, and I do believe that we can learn an awful lot from the fascist dictatorships of the 1930s when referring to it, but I think I'd rather stay away from a model.
It's very hard to share the podium when labeling the left, right, and totalitarian and all these terminologies are used in a very different concept by different person, but nonetheless, let me tell you, Nick, the first part of the Japan comparative question, I think it's very valid and important, and actually should pay more attention to about the similarities, and I cannot give you the full answer, but that's a very good point. And about the Robert Park's case and the 2010 August at Toronto, we had 3 countries global North Korean human rights convention. Canada, US, South Korea co-sponsored, and Canadian participation was overwhelmingly first-class, high-rank, serious from West to the East Coast. Prime Minister's office, parliamentarians, and great thinkers, and NGO leaders, the Korean-Canadian lawyers, politicians, businessmen, Toronto University students gather fully with also filmmakers. And it was very interesting because everybody agreed that we really saw the evidence, the factors' testimony. Actually, the 2 people brought out from Korea covering their faces with baseball cap and sunglasses because they are fairly recent arrival in South Korea. They testified about the brutal torture and all these things. Actually, Canadians, for the first time, I saw them very excited, very emotional. And yet, human rights is buried behind the North Korean nuke issue, and a lot of big things happening in the world. Somalia, people dying, reports coming. North Korea is not upfront to deliver these things, so issues are there. But the interesting thing that I raised actually it's sort of like a fun. Sudan has George Clooney, and Angelina Jolie in charge of all these sub-Saharan states of orphanage and everything. Where is the spokesperson for North Korean human rights? We don't have anybody, in a sense that there is a kind of sadness of a contemporary society. If you have a media doesn't hype raising the issue of really suffering people, which is systematically going through, still there are people. And yet, almost like as if you close your eyes, you don't want to touch that reality. The reality is there. So we have to bring up this issue, tying up together with the security issue, how to deal with it. My ultimate answer is very honest. We discussed 30 years about North Korea past models, theories, academic policies, sunshine policies, everything. But I think ultimate solution is that the regime has to be fundamentally transformed into an open society. Otherwise, we will have a nuke, human rights, starvation, cult, totalitarian, sadness, bloody emotion will prevail another next 20 years.
I will just respond to Peter, then I will go to the next round of questions. I guess I can say a couple of things. And when the Bush was in power, we had a very liberal government in South Korea. So, we pursued the sunshine policy that's consistent with my point, is that when one country has a hardline policy, North Korea has been able to find always another country that can be more like supportive or soft line. And remember, I wasn't advocating the Bush type of policy. I was advocating, if I ever advocate something, say combination of carrots and stick, that's then as a way of inferring or screening North Korean type. So I didn't support Bush type of hardline policy that are hardline both economically and militarily. Anyway, anybody else who wants to ask questions? Okay, behind you, the three gentlemen. Why don't you introduce yourself? Then, okay, we'll go just one step.
Ron,
Yes.
Ron Winthrop from the University of Western Ontario. A question mainly for Professor Myers, but it's related to that. I think that Professor Myers and Professor O are not as far apart as it would seem. The way it seems is they're totally and completely opposed to each other. One declares the regime to be a complete disaster. The other, that it's a success in a certain way, kind of in terms of its military might. But so, Professor Myers, you don't like the word cult to describe it, and you don't like the word totalitarian.
Wait a second. Where, when did I say anything about cult? I mean, I
just wrote it down here. Okay. So there's nothing cult-like about it either, nothing distinctively Confucian, and so on. And then when you say what makes it really successful is that it's an ethno-nationalist state. And then my question would be, why is it such an ethno-nationalist state? What makes it so successful in that respect? Are the North Koreans particularly racist by origin? Or somehow have they been propagandized into this state? In which case, if they have been propagandized into that state and brainwashed in the way that Professor O says, then it seems to me that in some ways the two of you are saying the same thing.
Sorry, a very simple question, but I just noticed some discrepancy between what Professor O and Professor Myers was saying with regards to the way that North Korea views the United States, with Brian saying that this kind of anti-Yankeeism is a defining feature of North Korean nationalism, and Professor O saying that actually the North Koreans that she's talked to have a very ambivalent attitude towards Americans. So I just wondered if you could sort of amplify a little bit or argue with each other.
Thank you. Leif Eric Easley, Ewha University. My question is primarily for Professor Myers, but if the other members of the panel would care to address it, I'd be very grateful. I was interested in a comment, I believe, made by Professor Winthrop earlier this morning, that because the North Korean regime is so paranoid about opening up, it seeks rents via nuclear blackmail. And while I think that's an important part of the story, I think, it seems to me at least, that the Kim regime is more dependent on China than it is on nuclear blackmail vis-a-vis, say, South Korea, Japan, the United States, and other countries. So the problem with this, I think, is that the dependence on China involves a gradual erosion of North Korean sovereignty. And if Professor Myers is right about North Korea being more ethno-nationalistic than it is communist or theocratic, and I believe he probably is right about that, then I think the implication is that North Korea's dependence on China is not politically sustainable for the Kim regime. So I'd really appreciate thoughts from the panel about how that may play out. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's sustainable. I think this is one more factor that is contributing to North Korea's adventurism and provocations of South Korea. The more it runs the risk of being perceived by its citizens as dependent on China, the more it needs to demonstrate its ethno-nationalist superiority to the South by scoring on the race enemy and on the Yankee colony to the South. So this is why I'm always kind of exasperated when Western journalists or foreigners seem to think that any kind of market opening, any kind of increase in trade between North Korea is automatically a good thing. It's automatically going to further the cause of peace. The more North Korea opens up, the more aggressive it seems to get. And this is not, I think, a coincidence. So that's another factor I think that needs to be looked at. Professor Winthrop's question, ethno-nationalism is always a hugely successful propaganda. If it's done systematically enough, people tend to respond very well to it. Of course, it appeals to some of the worst instincts in mankind, whereas, as we know, communism was a much harder sell. It had to, so to speak, go against the grain of human nature. But, of course, this does not mean that ethno-nationalism is something old and ingrained in people. There was no word for nation in the Korean language until a little over 100 years ago. The Koreans did not have the word minjok. They had to take it from the Japanese. And your average Yangban Korean in the 19th century felt much closer to the Chinese people in whose world he lived culturally than he felt to his own Korean neighbors. This was something that really was that the Koreans acquired during the colonial rule. And then in 1945, I believe that they basically Koreanized it, and gave the Koreans a lot of myths that they think are thousands of years old, like the myth of Mount Paektu, which really did not get underway here in South Korea until the Chundu Hwan period. As for the anti-Yankeeism, it's absolutely essential to North Korea. And some people say to me, well, maybe North Korea can drop the anti-American thing and sort of focus on vilifying the Japanese instead. Well, of course, that's just not going to work. It is just as crucial to the North Korean worldview as anti-Semitism is to the German worldview. They cannot normalize relations with the United States without becoming a second-rate South Korea and losing every single reason to exist. And the notion that you can have diplomatic relations with Washington with both Koreas and they can both, for some reason, find a reason to go on existing is, I think, unrealistic in the extreme.
Well, this morning we talked about the dichotomy or confrontational concept, either rational, person can be paranoid. Anti-Yankeeism is there as a propaganda basis, but at the same time, as I said, North Koreans, if you grab them without no conditions attached, in a very clean environment that face-to-face, ask simple question, no phrases attached, no conditional question. Their answer is very crystal clear, ordinary people. I never met them. We were educated to hate them, but we never encountered them. But the more you encounter in their own worldview, Chinese every day, they try to approach them with some desire to have some romance, some bribery, and some trading issue. And the more they close to their world, they don't like it. And that's the human nature. About the North Korean strategic calculation, no matter whether you like it or not, anti-Yankeeism used for the propaganda. But although we say U.S. is declining, but U.S. North Korea worldview is that mastermind of every important issue on nuclear issue, global arrangement, security issue, they would like to normalize. Unfortunately, in the American calculation, the strategic calculation, timing is important. When the timing was right, we were slow. When the timing was wrong, we were not interested. So I think basically the normalization will never happen. In a sense, deep, real engagement. So I think you see this kind of like a very different ambivalence, but I think the North Koreans do not have any particular deep hatred that automatically flare up, particularly when they encounter that the product of American security support, Japan, South Korea, today had such a great economic miracle. So that's my answer.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have for our session. Thank the panelists for their presentations and everyone in the audience for their time and great questions. Thank you, everyone.
This concludes our third.